Brother-in-law orchestrated the breakup of my marriage as revenge for a university rejection, leaving me heartbroken and my family torn. I'm 38 and I met my brother-in-law, who's also 38, when we were both at university. Back in our first year, he actually asked me out, and I refused. His response? He hurled the C word at me and called me shallow. When I told my best friend about it, she just brushed it off, saying those were harmless comments from some drunken guy who'd just been rejected, but I never really saw myself as shallow. Honestly, it was his whole demeanor, awkward and a bit off-putting, that made me say no in the first place. Still, I figured maybe my friend was right, because after that incident he never bothered me again. Not a glance my way, not a word. My university years went on, and I never felt uncomfortable around him after that. Nearly a decade later, my baby sister, 28, introduced her new boyfriend to the family. I didn't even recognize him at first, that's how long it had been since that night he'd last talked to me. But when he realized I didn't recognize him, he looked visibly annoyed and even called me a liar, right there in front of everyone. My family was skeptical of him, but he seemed to treat my sister well. He's very wealthy, took her all over the world, and appeared kind to all of us. My sister looked happy, and that mattered more than anything else. They married after a year of dating, and now they have 3 children together. Then I met my now ex-husband. He's 40, about 5 years ago. Looking back now, there was only one odd comment my brother-in-law made, telling me I was still as shallow and superficial as I'd been in university. At the time, I took it as a joke. Now, though, after everything that's happened, I realize it was an enormous red flag. He'd never shown any animosity toward my husband. He was always decent, though not exactly friendly or outgoing, which didn't seem odd given his reclusive nature. About a year ago, everything unraveled. My husband came home and accused me of cheating. He waved evidence in my face, nudes and messages, all sent from some guy I'd never met, who had these photos on his phone. This man reached out to my husband, said he hadn't realized I was married, and as soon as he found out, he contacted my ex, and even apologized to him. Nothing I said could convince my husband otherwise. He left me, and now our divorce is pending. Yesterday, everything changed again. The same guy who'd contacted my husband reached out to me. He apologized, confessed to everything, and told me he was friends with my brother-in-law. Then he sent me hundreds of messages and conversations, proof that my brother-in-law had been talking about me online for years. He'd never let go of that night in university, and in his words, I didn't even give him a chance and only judged him by his looks. In the chats, he calls me the C word, among other things, and discusses me with friends in group chats, constantly, obsessively. It turns out, they plotted all of this together, planned to destroy my reputation and marriage. My brother-in-law somehow got access to my photos, and they staged this vicious attack. The reason the friend came clean now? He felt racked with guilt, especially after hearing that my brother-in-law was still filled with anger and hatred when he found out I went on a date last weekend. The friend felt he'd gone too far and ruined innocent people's lives. He wanted to help make things right. Reflecting on it all now, I see my brother-in-law has been so much happier, more sociable, ever since my divorce began. I'd thought maybe he genuinely felt sorry and wanted to support me, but now I know the truth. The jokes about me ending up as a lonely spinster with cats as my only company, they're not jokes. He meant every word. All these years I thought he'd moved on, but he'd been seething with anger, driven by that one imagined slight so many years ago. What do I do? My sister is genuinely happy with him. I can't bear the idea of shattering her life, but I also can't pretend nothing has happened. I'm not sure what my next move should be. Should I even tell my ex? Even though I love him so much, it's devastating that he never believed me. He's my soulmate, but the trust is shattered. Does he deserve to know? Maybe he needs that closure, just as much as I do. Right now, I just feel so utterly heartbroken, so betrayed, so lost. Update 1. I have been living in a state of constant pain and relentless stress after everything that happened, but finally, the truth about what my brother-in-law did to me is out and exposed for the world to see. It's strange, some believe he must be in love with me, but in reality, he absolutely despises me, and he has since the day I rejected him. Hate is a terrifyingly powerful force, sometimes even more so than love. For anyone who thinks this is about me bragging that a man isn't over me after 20 years, let me tell you, that's not it. If you call this bragging, then there's something truly wrong. This has been hell for me, not some ego trip. The reality is, I have lived in fear for so long, terrified my brother-in-law would take his anger out on my sister because of me. He's a master at hiding how he feels, keeping that deep-seated hatred secret for years, so what else could he be capable of? I was paralyzed, constantly wondering whether my actions could end up hurting my sister and her children. That was always at the forefront of my mind, the only reason I ever seemed apathetic. I just didn't know what the right thing to do was, especially with someone as calculating as him. I couldn't risk making my family collateral damage. That's why I tiptoed through every decision. I know some people wanted me to be some indestructible, unshakable woman, but I have other priorities. Protecting my loved ones always came first. Eventually, my sister and I finally had the conversation we'd been avoiding. I love her and her children deeply, and seeing her in pain was excruciating. She was devastated, questioning everything about her marriage, and I couldn't blame her. So I went slow, trying to support her, making sure she knew I was there, and I laid out my honest concerns about her and her children staying with a man like him. For a while, I thought there was hope. I thought she was listening. But then something shifted, and I'm sure it had everything to do with her husband giving her an ultimatum: divorce him or cut off your family. In the end, she chose her marriage. It broke my parents and it broke me, but there's nothing we can do. It's her choice, even if we think he coerced her. Maybe a part of me hopes she truly believes he can be better than we think, that he's not the same man with them as he's shown me. I'm desperately clinging to that tiny shred of hope. She wrote to us, telling us to forget that she and her children ever existed, threatening legal action if we tried to reach out. And now my brother-in-law has disappeared from social media, abandoned by his friends, shunned by everyone who knows what he's done. I hear he's planning to leave the city because his reputation has been destroyed. People shame him even at work, and he barely leaves the house. Meanwhile, my own marriage is dissolving. My ex-husband and I are moving forward with the divorce. I don't blame him for believing the rumors. Deep down, though, I wish he'd known me well enough to trust I would never be capable of cheating. It hurts, especially since he moved back for my sake, maybe hoping we could try again. But I can't do it. He has apologized over and over, insisting he never truly believed the lies, but I've started to realize our marriage simply wasn't strong enough to survive this. Maybe neither of us was as strong as we thought. The only solace I have is the new relationship I started, just before all hell broke loose. After over a year where I couldn't even get out of bed, I met someone. He's seen all of this unfold and still chooses to be patient and supportive. For the first time in a long time, I believe I have a real shot at happiness. At least now, he knows everything, and he's prepared in case my brother-in-law tries anything again. Maybe, finally, I'll get my peace. Update 2. After everything that happened, I made the decision to move away. It was the best thing I could have done for my sanity. The breaking point came after my brother-in-law cornered me one evening after work, demanding that we talk. He wouldn't let go of my arm, gripping me so tightly that I had a blue mark on my wrist for days afterward. I was absolutely terrified, and I broke down crying right there in front of him. He pleaded with me to take everything back, desperate because people were now calling him a creep and an incel, and he felt his reputation slipping away. He insisted that I had never given him a chance to explain himself, hurling insults at me, calling me a C. I was so relieved when a colleague noticed what was happening and called the police, but in the end, nothing came of it. Even when I reported him for harassment, the case was dismissed as though there was no evidence. I couldn't even obtain a protective order. My sister completely cut me off. She started spreading the story that I cheated, and she stuck by her husband, I guess trying to save face. At first, she wouldn't even let my parents speak with her, but eventually, their relationship mended, though only on the condition that they also cut me out of their lives. And they did. I don't blame them for siding with her. She has her children, and honestly, she and her kids probably need their protection more than I do. It's been almost a year since I last saw my mother. I miss my sister, her kids, and my parents every single day, but that's just how things played out. My ex-husband and I finalized our divorce. It was the best decision for both of us, even if it felt, in a way, like my brother-in-law won. Though, truthfully, he didn't win anything. He's still bitter and hateful as ever. I finally said to him and to my sister that no matter what happens to me, it will never satisfy him. What he can't stand is that he never had me. That was the final straw. My sister blocked me for good, and my parents followed her lead. Again, I don't blame them. Now I'm in a new city, living a new life with my boyfriend. I don't have any contact with my family anymore. My ex-husband claims I ruined his life. I hope one day he can forgive me, though I never set out to ruin anything. In spite of everything, I feel happiness trickling back in. My new job is fantastic, and I managed to keep friendships back home while making new friends here. My boyfriend has been incredible through all of this, supporting me entirely and introducing me to his family, who welcomed me as one of their own. We now live closer to them and I finally feel safe. My brother-in-law hasn't reached out, hasn't tried to contact me or even mentioned my name since I left. And honestly, that silence is worth everything. Update 3. I thought the silence meant it was finally over. I was wrong. It started with a call after midnight from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. When I did, I heard my sister's voice and one of the kids crying in the background. She was on the motorway, she said. She was coming to me. Then the line cut out. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed with my coat on until my boyfriend flicked on the lamp and we waited together like that, staring at the door, counting headlights on the wall. She arrived just before 3 with the children in their pajamas and one backpack between them. She looked like someone had pulled her out of her own life by the roots. She didn't even ask to come in, she just stepped over the threshold and sank down on the hallway rug and started shaking so hard the children stood there quiet as if they'd been told to be. The only thing she said, over and over, was that she was sorry. I didn't ask her why she was there until the children were asleep on our sofa with my boyfriend's hoodie over them. When we were finally alone in the kitchen, she put a phone on the table and slid it to me as if it were something dangerous. It was an old black Android with a cracked corner and a cheap case. She'd found it in a locked shoebox in his office tucked behind tax folders and a stack of old leases. The passcode was his mother's birthday. She had only looked because the night before he'd come home with that dead-eyed calm he used to wear after a long business dinner, but there was no dinner, and she recognized the way he walked past the children without seeing them. She told me she felt something catch in her chest and wouldn't let go. So the next day, while he was in the shower, she went looking for. She doesn't even know what. She said she should have done it years ago. The phone was a museum of rot. There were chat apps I'd never heard of. There were folders named like jokes. There were videos of my sister sleeping, a camera balanced on a dresser aimed at their bed. There were messages to the same friend who had confessed to me months ago, still there, stretching years back, talking about me like I was a problem they were engineering around. There was my name on a list. And there were other names. So many other names. Under one folder there was an album called Projects. He hadn't only fixated on destroying me. He'd treated women like a set of tasks to be completed. There were payment confirmations to a data broker for a background check on my ex-husband. There were screenshots of my old email security questions with answers only someone who had been inside my family would know. There were screen recordings of him coaching his friend on what to say to my ex. In one voice message he laughed. He actually laughed. He said, "She'll fold. She always folds if you make it about family." My sister said when she confronted him he became very still. He didn't yell, he smiled like a photograph and told her she'd misunderstood everything and asked where the phone was. When she wouldn't give it to him, he reached for their eldest iPad on the table and smashed it against the counter so hard the screen blew into dust. The youngest started screaming. Then he told her to go upstairs and fix her face. She put the phone in the backpack with the children's school jumpers and drove. The next morning we went to the police. I brought the phone, my sister brought her hands, and the way they wouldn't stop rubbing the same patch of skin raw. This time it was different. It wasn't me in a corridor with a blue mark on my wrist and his denial floating in the air between us. It was a device full of his own words and timestamps and IP addresses. It was his voice. The officer called in an investigator, and a woman from a domestic violence charity took my sister to another room and didn't let go of her hand. They imaged the phone while we sat in a plastic chair and watched sunlight move down the wall and then up again. When we left, we had an emergency protective order and a court date in 2 weeks. He tried to collect the children from school that afternoon. The school had been warned. My sister and I sat in the car around the corner and I could see my own reflection in the windscreen, and it looked like someone else's mouth opening and closing like a fish. We watched men in high-vis vests and mothers with buggies, and then our two ran out flanked by a teacher, cheeks pink with cold, looking for us. When I pulled away I checked the rearview mirror every block, expecting headlights I recognized. There were none. I sent my ex-husband 3 things: a screen recording of my brother-in-law telling his friend what to send and when, a spreadsheet he'd made comparing time zones and my ex's shifts for maximum impact, and a photo of a draft message with my name spelled wrong in the first line. It took him less than a minute to call me. For a moment I thought his voice would unspool me. He didn't ask for anything, he didn't promise anything, he just cried in that awful, shocked way men cry when years of certainty get pulled out from under them. He said, "I'm so sorry," and then stopped speaking like he didn't know which apology belonged where. It didn't feel victorious. It didn't feel like anything but the sound of a house settling after a storm. I told him I forgave him for what was his to be forgiven, and that my life had moved. He asked if he could send me something in return. A week later I received a signed statement from him for the police, and a photo of his hand folded over a letter he had written for himself. It wasn't for me. I was glad. My parents called from a number I didn't have saved, and my mother's first word was my name, and I had to sit down on the pavement outside the supermarket because my legs wouldn't hold me. They had heard from my sister because she needed passports and birth certificates and answers to questions only our father knew. My mother's voice sounded older. She didn't ask me to explain. She asked if I would meet them. I told her not yet. I don't know if that was kinder or cruel. The court date wasn't the ending I thought it would be. He showed up in an iron shirt with a solicitor and that same photograph smile, but he wouldn't look at me. My sister sat so straight it looked like someone was holding her by the spine. The judge listened to the recordings and looked at the messages and then looked at him and asked him if he had anything to say. He didn't speak at first. When he finally did, his voice was small. He tried to make it all sound like banter that had gotten out of hand, a prank that had gone wrong, a joke people didn't get. He said the word context like it might save him. The judge granted a 3-year order for my sister and the children, and 1 for me. As we waited in the corridor for the paperwork, he walked past with his solicitor and tried to tilt his head toward me. A security officer stepped between us and he changed direction like a weather vane. The hardest part came afterward. My sister filed for separation. She went back to their house with 2 officers and a locksmith and her friends from work, and she packed up the children's clothes and their school books and the stuffed rabbit with one eye that the youngest will not sleep without. He wasn't there, but he had left a bowl in the sink and a glass turned upside down on the counter as if he were planning on coming back that evening to pour himself water and sit down like nothing had moved. The officers found a second camera drilled into the baseboard behind a plant in the living room. They stopped counting after 4. One of them looked so angry he had to leave the room. The friend, the same one who first told me the truth, came forward properly. He gave the police a statement and handed over his phones and signed his name with a hand that couldn't keep still. I had thought I hated him, and I probably did, But when I saw him waiting outside the interview room with his shoulders hunched near his ears like he was trying to make himself smaller, what I felt was something else entirely. He couldn't look at me. I didn't make him. A detective called last week to say that they are considering cyber harassment charges and that the Crown Prosecution Service is reviewing the file. I don't know how long anything will take or what it will look like at the end. I've stopped trying to imagine outcomes. There's a box at our door with a new chain and a bell camera my boyfriend installed, and a pile of school newsletters on the kitchen table with names scrawled across the top in felt tip. At night, when the children are asleep and my sister has finally let her body sink into the sofa without bracing, she tells me little things about her day as if they were treasure. The dentist who sang along to the radio. The neighbor who brought over lasagna and didn't ask for our story. The way our mother still makes tea too strong and pretends she doesn't. She's been to counseling twice and has stopped apologizing every time she takes up space. I didn't expect her to smile again so soon, but she does, sometimes, and when she does it's like remembering a song from childhood you thought you'd forgotten. He hasn't contacted me once. Not a call. Not a look. Not a shadow. The silence is different now. It doesn't feel like a pause before the next thing. It feels like winter after a long autumn, cold but honest. I bought a small second-hand dining table with a stain in the wood shaped like a map, and last night there were 5 plates on it, and 5 glasses of milk, and someone spilled and we didn't even bother to mop it up straight away. The children go to sleep clutching a hot water bottle and in the morning they call my boyfriend uncle without thinking about it, like their mouths were always going to say it that way. If there's any justice at all, it looks like this. Not a verdict. Not a speech. Just a quiet house where doors are only doors and not escape plans. Update 4. The letter came folded into itself like a little animal pretending to be smaller. Cream paper, a crest at the top, our name spelled out in the sort of serif font that makes you behave. He had applied to the family court for contact. My sister sat at the table with her hands flat like she was keeping it from floating away. She read the first paragraph, then the second, then she reached up and touched her throat as if she'd forgotten which way to breathe. It wasn't about the children, not really. It was about getting his face back inside our days. The CAF case officer was called Ruth and she took her shoes off at the door without being asked and sat on the living room rug like she lived here. She asked for favorite colors, favorite dinners, who tells the best jokes. The eldest told her a story about a pigeon that had eaten a chip in the playground and then, in the way children do when their minds nudge them sideways, mentioned the red light under the big chair that used to blink at night. It took me a second to understand he meant the armchair by the window at my sister's old house. I felt something slide cold along my spine. After Ruth left I watched my sister walk to the sink and wash her hands like they'd been dipped in something invisible. 2 days later my boyfriend pulled a thin gray circle from under the boot liner of the car with 2 fingers like he'd found a living thing. It made a noise that was both too quiet and too bright all at once when he touched it. The officer from before came in a fluorescent jacket even though it wasn't raining and shut the door behind him and called it a tracker. He photographed the serial number and put it in a bag with a zip and wrote our names on a line with a pen that had a chewed cap. Bail conditions are mostly words until someone shows you the object that proves they weren't enough. The detective rang just before tea and I stood with the phone pressed to my ear and watched the kettle judder on the worktop. CPS had authorized charges. There was a string of them, ordinary words made sharp: stalking, the cameras, the messages, access without permission, the way he'd turned my life and my sister's into a map he thought he owned. The detective told me they had arrested him leaving his office with a weekend bag. It was such a small sentence that I nearly missed the way he put it, like he was telling me he'd caught a cat on a wall, not a man we used to eat Sunday roasts beside. My sister put her hand over her mouth and made a noise that hurts to remember. I think it was the sound relief makes when it finally finds a way out. He pleaded not guilty because of course he did. His solicitor filed something that tried to make wires into misunderstandings and cameras into modern life. The same week CAF case sent their safeguarding letter. I opened it on the stairs. They had recommended no contact for now. Reading the word no written down like that felt like a little gate clicking shut. My parents came with a box of biscuits in a paper bag and my mother's eyes took a moment to find everything they were looking for in our hallway. She lifted my face like she hadn't been allowed to use both hands in months and then she was crying and saying my name into my hair the way people say prayers when they think no one will hear. My father found the wobbly dining chair and turned it over and put it right with a coin under one leg and then sat down as if he hadn't used his own knees in a long time. It didn't fix anything and it fixed so much. We went to the first family hearing in a building that smells gently of dust and photocopiers, to a room with windows that don't open. My sister answered questions without her voice faltering and when it threatened to she smoothed her skirt with the edge of her hand and found it again. He sat across the aisle and stared at the place his thumb meets his palm like he'd never seen it before. No interim contact. The next date for when people with clipboards would be ready to say more. The security guard at the entrance nodded at me the way people do when they've seen your face more than once. On the criminal side, they gave him conditions so tight he could barely inhale without breaching them. He surrendered his passport, or what he said was his only one, and that night I slept with my phone under my pillow anyway. His friend, the one who set the first domino, walked into a police station with 2 carrier bags and asked a receptionist where to put them. The bags were full of devices he hadn't been brave enough to hand over the first time. I heard this secondhand from the detective, but I could see it perfectly, the way you do a thing late and hope it still counts. A journalist knocked one afternoon and I stood behind the chain and told her we had nothing to say, and the whole time I could see the reflection of my sister on the hall mirror, her mouth a flat line with a child hooked on one hip. The neighbor, the lasagna one, stuck her head out and asked if the journalist wanted to buy a raffle ticket for the school fair, and the woman laughed and went away. It felt like a small enchantment. The hidden cameras are their own slow earthquake. The forensics team sent a list so factual it might as well have been a shopping receipt. Dresser. Baseboard. Vent. A shelf drilled hollow. No kids' rooms. The relief is a real thing I can feel under my ribs, and it doesn't change the way I want to tear the plaster off the walls myself. There are names on some of the folders we didn't recognize. The detective asked if my sister would be willing to be a point of contact if those women wanted to speak to someone who will understand what a hallway looks like when you don't trust it. She said yes without hesitation, and then went to sit in the bathroom for 10 minutes with the extractor fan on so no one would hear her trying to put herself back together. My ex-husband came to the city for work and sent a message the way you put a letter in a bottle and see if the tide takes it. We met for coffee in a place with a counter full of small cakes, and he had new lines at the corner of his mouth that I hadn't earned. He apologized to my sister without making it another stone she had to carry. He brought a file with old emails he had dug out of an account he'd stopped using, and there were headers and routes that showed the way everything had been folded to look like me and not me. He asked about the children, and when I told him they call my boyfriend uncle, he looked away and smiled with his mouth closed. As we left, he put his hand on my shoulder in a way that was both a goodbye and a thank you, and I walked home in air that felt newly invented. Yesterday there was a hearing about his bail because the tracker isn't a misunderstanding. The magistrate asked him a question so simple it might have been a school test and he answered it wrong, or maybe he refused to answer it at all. Either way, they took him down. The phrase sounds old-fashioned until you see the people in navy shirts and radios make a small semicircle of space and he steps into it and disappears. We went home and the children did their homework, and my boyfriend burned the first pancake and the second, and on the third one everything was fine, and my sister sent a message to Ruth with a photo of 3 plates dusted with sugar like frost. At night now there are new sounds. The radiator's ticking because the air is cold. The quiet clap the new chain makes when the door moves in its frame. The cat from 2 doors along that has decided our doormat is its afternoon. The court dates sit on the calendar like map pins, small and red. Between them there is laundry and school gates, and my mother getting the tea wrong and pretending she didn't, and the youngest sitting on the bottom stair to make sure the post doesn't land on his feet. It isn't an ending and it isn't a beginning. It's the middle, and it's bearable. The house has learned our names. The doors open and close for ordinary reasons. The winter outside is honest and blameless, and the days are longer by minutes at a time, the way dawn keeps its promises if you let it. Update 5. The trial date slid into our lives the way cold does through the gap under a door, quiet, inevitable, there before you have words for it. It was printed on paper the color of dry bones with a black stamp in the corner, and it told us where to be and when and which entrance to use. In the weeks before, someone from witness care took us into a small room with carpet that ate sound and showed us the screen we could sit behind if we wanted it, the live link room with a camera so kind it made your face into a softer version of itself. I held a paper cup and could hear my own pulse in it. They asked if there was anything we needed. My sister said a chair that doesn't wobble, and the woman smiled like she wished she could produce one from her handbag. He was brought over in a van before we had finished our first coffees. The building has that faint sweet dust smell old libraries do, and when you look up the ceiling makes you think of swimming pools. The usher told us not to look around if we didn't want to, and then everyone said our names as if they belonged on their tongues, and not just in our house, and I felt my hands remember last winter and all its doors. He was smaller than the last time because a suit that knows more about starch than fabric does not forgive anyone much, and because glass makes everyone look like they're on the far side of themselves. I had expected my body to forget how to sit, but it found a way. The barrister for the Crown wore a ring that flashed when she turned a page and spoke like she had a metronome tucked somewhere close. Half of this is choreography, I learned. When to stand. When to move. When to understand that the thing happening near you is your life and is also a piece of paper. We were waiting for the first witness when the usher came to our little room with her radio lit up like a tiny city and told us to hold on, to not go anywhere, to breathe if we could. The prosecution had been called into the judge's chambers. There were 2 benches outside in the corridor, and the same 2 men in navy shirts who had walked him down the steps at the last hearing stood like punctuation in the space between them. When the door opened again, the barrister looked the way people do when they have won something you cannot hold. He had changed his plea. To most of it. Stalking with fear of violence, admitted. The covert recording, admitted. The unauthorized access, admitted. The bit that tried to turn my name into a toy, admitted. It turns out that chain links are no different if they are words. Once enough hold you, you cannot pretend you are not in them. His solicitor had tried to carve out small islands for him, but the tide was busy. The judge said there was no need to put me or my sister in a box today. There would be a sentencing hearing and we could say what needed saying there. I didn't realize I'd been planning sentences in my head until I felt them slide off me and land somewhere I couldn't reach. They listed the other women like you list cities on a train line. One name made my sister put her hand on my knee without looking at me. I met two of them in the corridor by accident when I pushed the wrong door open, and we all stared for a second like we were facing versions of ourselves we hadn't expected. One had a baby under her coat and the other had a scar like a comma by her lip. Neither asked me anything you could answer out loud. We stood with our forearms touching, sharing salt from our skin as if it were a sign you could exchange in a place where you weren't allowed to pass anything but words. Family court kept moving alongside it like a shadow choosing its own pace. Kefkes sent the report that smelt faintly of a photocopier that had been running too long. They used sentences that made space for children to breathe inside them. No contact for now became no contact while the criminal case was alive, became no contact pending further assessment, became a shape you could start to trust. A judge with half-moon glasses picked up his pen and wrote it down, and then that was the law. We went home and hung school pictures on the wall we used to call the wonky wall, and it refused to be wonky for us anymore. There is a particular kind of quiet that lands when an apology is the right size for once. He, the friend, asked to speak to my sister. He did it through the detective, and then he waited where they told him to wait, outside a station with a glass front and a man sweeping leaves in a straight line that had no business being that straight. He looked like sleep had been something other people did. He said he had told everything, and then he said it again, and then he said he knew it wasn't enough. My sister didn't tell him she forgave him. She told him to mail the devices with a signed note every time he remembered one, and to keep going to the same room with the plastic chairs where men who don't want to be the kind of men they've been sit and speak sentences to the floor until they make sense out loud. He nodded like someone hearing a diagnosis he had half expected. Our parents are learning our timetable like it's a new tune. My father turns up with things he found in his shed and says they are useful even when they are not, and my mother keeps pouring tea we have to dilute with hot water, and she pretends to be offended when we do. They came to the school assembly where the eldest name was read, and my mother cried like she used to during car adverts at Christmas. My ex-husband came round once and stood in the tiny front garden with my boyfriend, and they talked about boiler pressure while the children made chalk cities on the path at their feet. It was a small, modern piece with grit in it, and it felt better than anything I used to try and imagine late at night. They set sentencing for a Friday, so the building was full of the sound of heels and the coil of weekend sitting in everyone's ribs. I printed my statement on paper thicker than necessary because it felt like I might need the weight. The usher took us into the same small room and asked if we wanted water, and then the barrister came and said we could read if we wanted or we could let her. It was entirely ours. No one would force our mouths to do anything, not now, not here. My sister read. I watched her build a bridge over a river and walk across it using only her voice. She didn't talk about the day he smashed the tablet or the way the red light blinked under the armchair. She talked about laughing less and learning how to again, about the tiny hands asleep in her bed the first night she ran, about the way children look taller when they aren't worried anymore. When she was finished, she folded the paper into fourths with such precision I could see the lines from where I sat. The judge spoke for a long time. He has one of those faces that looks like it has spent a lot of time listening to people who didn't want to be heard. He spoke about patterns and planning and breath, mine and my sister's, and what it means when somebody reaches into the part of a person they should not be able to reach. He spoke about how fear isn't a feeling you have to prove with bruises to make it real. He looked at him and said his name the way school registers say names when they are trying to teach a room the rhythm of a body. He gave numbers that are both just numbers and also architecture. We will live inside them for a little while. 4 years inside, half on license, an indefinite restraining order that he told the clerk to write carefully with our names in full. The order allows us to open our own front door without thinking of it as a threshold we have to argue. He will not be allowed near schools, near our road, near the places we have said contain our lives. He looked at the floor when the order was read, as if he had misplaced something there. Afterwards, in the kind of sunlight that only happens on steps like those, we stood without knowing where to put our hands because the air felt too clean to hold. One of the other women stood beside me and we looked at the too wide street for a while. He was never going to be sorry, she said, and it felt like a stone you can finally stop balancing in your palm. The police officer with the chewed pen cap walked past and said he'd see us at the station next week to sign the papers, and for a second I forgot that people's jobs continue after your life's loudest noises. The house keeps shrinking and then growing as if it's breathing with us. We sold the big table and bought one with a seam down the middle where leaves can go in if you have too many people and not enough surface. My sister signed something at her solicitor's that gave the words final and order a place to live together, and a number appeared in her bank account that was not as much as we thought it should be and exactly enough to make another start. We went back to the old house with 2 officers, 1 locksmith, and a pocket full of keys that didn't fit anywhere anymore. The garden had gone to nettles and the roses had thrown hips that looked like beads. The bedroom walls have their own shadows now because the cameras are gone and the paint remembers where they were. On the bus home, a woman's hair smelled like apples and the youngest fell asleep with her mouth open, catching flies like she's always done, and my sister looked out of the window and then down at her own hands as if to check they were still hers. When we got in, the cat from 2 doors along was already on our mat in a puddle of itself, and my boyfriend stepped over it and burned the first pancake again, and the second, and then got the third right and smiled like he'd solved a small important problem. Later, after toothbrushes and the stripy pajamas and the way the eldest always forgets to turn off the bathroom light, I went outside with the recycling and stood under a sky so clean it sounded like a lie. The chain on the door has a new shine to it where we touch it with our thumbs. My phone buzzed with a message from Ruth reminding my sister that she is allowed to put nothing in the lunchboxes but sandwiches and fruit and not apology. The radiator ticked. Someone 2 gardens away laughed. He is where he is. We are where we are. The calendar has fewer red pins and more penciled hearts where school trips go and dentist appointments and my mother's birthday and an idea about the seaside when it's warm enough to take your shoes off and put your feet in water that will forgive you your whole history. We are not brave in the way people mean when they say it. We are just here. We are here, and the house knows our names, and when the post lands, the youngest runs to the door and holds it in her hands like treasure and no one has to check if it's safe before she does.